There is a god in Elden Ring that never speaks a single word of dialogue. It has no character model. It never appears on screen in any form you could point to and say that is it. And yet it is arguably the single most influential entity in the entire game. Every major faction you encounter, every war you stumble into the aftermath of, every corpse you loot, every crumbling ruin you climb through, exists in the shadow of this thing's decisions. I'm talking about the Greater Will, the outer god whose golden light gives the Erd Tree its glow, whose ideology gave birth to the Golden Order, and whose silence, sometime before the game begins, is the actual inciting incident for everything you do as the Tarnished. Today I want to go as deep as the game allows on this entity. What it is, where it apparently comes from, how it operates, why it chose the lands between, what the Elden Beast actually is in relation to it, why it went quiet, and what that silence means for every character who built their life around serving it. This is going to be long, so let's just get into it. Before we get into the Greater Will specifically, we need to establish what an outer god even is in this cosmology, because Elden Ring's metaphysics are not spelled out in a codex entry anywhere. They're scattered across item descriptions, environmental details, and inference. The word outer god itself is barely used in the game's own text. It's a term the community adopted, partly influenced by From Software's general fascination with cosmic horror and outside forces, and partly because the game's few direct references to the outer gods as a category make it clear there are multiple entities of this type, of which the Greater Will is only one. The clearest textual anchor we have is the item description for the Rune of Death, which states that Destined Death was removed from the lands between and given to the Black Blade, and that the Greater Will orchestrated this specifically to keep the Elden Ring from being interfered with by outside forces. Other descriptions reference the Formless Mother, the deity behind the Deathbirds and the Omen phenomenon, and behind Fia and the Deathroot storyline. Still others reference the Frenzied Flame, which is described in terms that strongly suggest it too is an outer god, or something adjacent to one that opposes the Golden Order's stability with a philosophy of total, indiscriminate unity through immolation. And there are further hints of other cosmic forces, the moon, associated with Ranni and the Carrion royal family, which seems to represent something distinct from typical outer god influence, more like an absence, a void, a rejection of outer god involvement altogether. So when we say outer god, what we're describing is a category of entity that exists outside the world of the lands between, that is not native to it, and that exerts influence into the world through emissaries, ideology, and in the case of the Greater Will, an actual physical avatar embedded in the world's central cosmological structure. These are not gods in the classical sense of beings who simply have great power and rule over mortals directly. They are something closer to Lovecraftian outside intelligences who communicate through proxies, whose true nature is incomprehensible, or at least inexpressible to the beings who serve them, and who seem to operate according to motivations that are alien to human concerns, even when their proxies frame those motivations in human terms like order, or death, or unity, or madness. This framing matters enormously for understanding the Greater Will, because so much of the confusion players have about it comes from taking the Golden Order's framing of the Greater Will at face value. The Golden Order describes the Greater Will as a benevolent architect of order, harmony, and the natural cycle of life and death. But the Golden Order is a human and semi-human institution, built by Queen Marika, and later corrupted and reshaped by Radagon, Godwyn, the Erd Tree clergy, and centuries of doctrine. It is a lens, not a direct transcription of the Greater Will's actual nature or intentions. When we try to understand the Greater Will itself, we have to try to see past the Golden Order's mythology to the sparser, stranger clues about what's actually happening underneath it. So let's start at the beginning, as far back as the game's lore allows us to go, which is the Age of the Stars, sometimes called the Age of the Stars in fan shorthand, though the game itself just refers to it as the era before the coming of the Erd Tree, when the lands between was ruled by the primeval currents of the stars, and Astel and the other void-born creatures known as the Formless Cult existed as a kind of pre-order civilization. Before Marika, before the Erd Tree, before the Golden Order as we know it, the lands between had a different cosmology entirely, one oriented around the stars and a force called the Primeval Current, associated with Ranni's storyline, with the Carrion royal family's obsession with the moon, and with the Finger Creeper and Astel enemies you find in the deep parts of the world, especially beneath Nokron and Noxtella and Sealfur River, and further in Ranni's own storyline through the Divine Tower of Liurnia, and the lunar themes throughout her arc. this pre-Erdtree civilization. The ancient people who lived beneath the earth in the eternal cities worshipped or were shaped by these stellar and lunar forces. Then, at some point, the Greater Will arrived, or rather the Greater Will's influence arrived, and everything changed. The item descriptions and environmental storytelling around Nokron and Noxtella and the Eternal Cities all suggest that these older civilizations were essentially destroyed, or at least eclipsed and buried, as a consequence of the Greater Will's coming. The meteor that struck the Earth and formed the crater where Nokron sits. The meteor associated with Radon's ancestors and the Star Scourge Radon's own connection to gravity and the stars. All of this points to the Greater Will's arrival being an actual cataclysmic event within the game's own internal history, not just a slow ideological shift. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The Elden Ring. The actual Golden Ring structure at the heart of the game's central MacGuffin predates the Greater Will's full dominance. The Elden Ring is described in various item texts as being extremely ancient, connected to the primordial rune, sometimes called the Elden Beast rune in community shorthand, and it seems to have existed, at least in potential or embryonic form, before Marika, before the Erdtree, possibly even as the physical manifestation of the Greater Will's presence in this reality from the very beginning. The Elden Beast itself, which we fight at the very end of the game, is widely understood to be the actual physical form, or at least the closest thing to a physical form, of the Greater Will itself. Not a servant, not a messenger, not an incarnation the way Marika is an incarnation of a rune, but something closer to the god's own body, tethered to and expressed through the Elden Ring, which functions as both a crown, a law, and a leash all at once. I want to sit with that idea for a while, because I think it's one of the most important and most underexplained pieces of Greater Will lore in the whole game. When you fight the Elden Beast at the end of the game, after killing Radagon, what you're fighting is not a general or a champion or an avatar, in the sense that Godfrey is an avatar of Marika's military power. You are fighting, as close as the game will ever let you get, the actual entity that has been running the show. It doesn't have a face you'd recognize as a face. It doesn't speak. Its attacks involve constellations, golden light, cosmic energy that reads more like physics than like violence. It doesn't beg, plead, rage, or monologue, unlike literally every other final tier boss in the game. Millennia has dialogue. Radagon and Marika have agonized, tortured expressions and body language that reads as suffering. The Elden Beast has none of that. It is simply, coldly, present, executing whatever function it exists to execute, indifferent in a way that borders on the truly alien. This indifference, I'd argue, is the single most important characteristic of the Greater Will as an entity, more important than any specific ideological content we can extract from the Golden Order. The Greater Will does not seem to care about individual mortal lives, individual suffering, or even the survival of individual champions who have served it faithfully for centuries. It cares about a much larger, more abstract project, one that the Golden Order tries to translate into human moral terms as harmony, order, the sanctity of death, and so on, but which in its raw form seems to be something more like cosmic maintenance, the propagation of a particular pattern or structure across worlds, using the lands between as one site among potentially many where this pattern is cultivated. This is where the concept of the Greater Will as a name becomes genuinely important, and I don't think it's just a cool-sounding title. A Greater Will implies there are lesser wills, individual wills, the wills of Marika, of Godfrey, of the player character, of every NPC you meet, all of which are meant to be subordinated to, folded into, or aligned with this larger will. The entire structure of the Golden Order, its emphasis on obedience, on the Erdtree as the singular authoritative structure of law and faith, on demigods ruling as extensions of Marika's will rather than as independent actors, all of this reflects a cosmology in which individual agency is supposed to bend toward a greater cosmic agency. The tragedy of the game's plot, and I'd argue this is the central tragedy underlying almost every character arc in Elden Ring, is what happens when the Greater Will's guiding hand is withdrawn, and all these lesser wills, previously subordinated, are suddenly forced to reckon with their own autonomy, usually catastrophically. So with that framing established, let's talk about how the Greater Will actually operates within the world, because it doesn't rule directly. It has never, as far as we can tell from any textual evidence in the game, spoken directly to a mortal in a way that mortal could understand as unmediated communication. Everything the Greater Will says or wants comes through intermediaries. This is a crucial structural feature of the entity, and I think it's meant to evoke both classical religious structures, where prophets and priests mediate between an unknowable divine and a mortal congregation, and cosmic horror structures, where the true nature of an outside intelligence is so alien that any direct contact would be either impossible to interpret or actively harmful to the mortal mind attempting to process it. The primary intermediaries are the two fingers and the three fingers, and I want to spend a substantial amount of time on both of these, because they represent in a sense the two competing tendencies within the greater will's own multiplicity, or at least within how mortals have interpreted and organized around it. The two fingers reside at the round table hold, in that eerie sealed chamber you can access from fairly early in the game, sitting atop what's described as the tail end of the fingers of God, severed digits or the remnants of a hand, floating in blackness, murmuring in a language no mortal, not even Inaya, the finger reader who serves them, can fully comprehend. When you first arrive in the lands between, having died and been resurrected as a tarnished, it is the two fingers who have called you back. Grace, the golden light that guides you throughout the game toward key locations, sites of grace, points of interest, and eventually toward the endgame, is popularly understood to be a form of favor or guidance granted by the two fingers, on behalf of, or as an extension of, the greater will's own attention. The two fingers rule, as described by Enya and by other NPCs like the finger-reading rituals you can witness, is essentially electoral. They are searching for a new Elden Lord, a mortal champion capable of restoring the Elden Ring after Marika shattered it, and by extension, restoring the Golden Order to some semblance of stability, though crucially, not necessarily the exact same stability that existed before. The two fingers gather tarnished, the exiled, the death-touched, the ones who were cast out of the lands between generations ago after failing to become Elden Lord themselves, and call them back now that the ring is shattered, in the hopes that one of them will succeed where Marika, and by extension the entire prior order, failed. Now here's an important nuance that a lot of surface-level lore summaries miss. The two fingers do not tell you what to do. They do not command you to restore the Golden Order specifically. Enya, when you speak to her, and the various finger-reading dialogue you get throughout the game, is notably vague and almost evasive about what exactly the correct outcome is supposed to be. This vagueness is not a writing oversight. It's thematically loaded. The Greater Will, through the two fingers, seems to want a new Elden Lord, a new consolidation of power around the Elden Ring, but it does not seem to care, or at least it does not make explicit, what ideological content that new Elden Lord brings to the throne. This is why the game supports so many wildly different endings, from restoring the Golden Order in a fairly conservative sense, to Ranni's Age of Stars ending which explicitly rejects the Greater Will's involvement entirely, to the Frenzied Flame ending which burns everything down, to Godwin's? No, sorry, to Godfrey's return under Radahn's champion in the shadow of the Erd Tree material, to the Duskborn or Age of Order endings. The ambiguity of the Two Fingers guidance suggests something important about the Greater Will's actual priority. It doesn't necessarily need a specific doctrinal outcome preserved. It needs the Elden Ring itself, the structure, the law, the binding force, to be remade and reasserted by someone with sufficient will and power to hold it together. The content of that someone's rules seems almost secondary. This is a genuinely unsettling implication if you sit with it, because it suggests the Greater Will's interest in order is not moral in the way the Golden Order's clergy present it as moral. It's structural. It wants the shape of order to exist, a strong central authority anchored to the Erd Tree and the Elden Ring, more than it wants any particular ethical content within that order. Now let's turn to the Three Fingers, because they represent something quite different, and their existence tells us something crucial about how the Greater Will as a singular entity might not be as unified as its name implies, or, alternatively, tells us that the Greater Will contains within itself multiple currents or aspects that can come into conflict. The Three Fingers reside beneath the Round Table hold, in the Three Fingers chamber accessible only after certain conditions are met, deep in a corrupted, twisted version of the same architecture that houses the Two Fingers above, where the Two Fingers are associated with grace, gold, and the sanctioned path toward becoming Elden Lord within something resembling the existing order. The Three Fingers are associated with flame, madness, and the Frenzied Flame ending, one of the most extreme and destructive outcomes in the game. The community has debated for years whether the Three Fingers represent a genuinely separate entity, a kind of fallen or corrupted fragment of the Greater Will, or whether they're better understood as belonging to a different outer god entirely, one whose influence has somehow become entangled with, or parasitic upon the same physical/metaphysical structure the two fingers occupy. The game's text is deliberately ambiguous here, but there's a reasonably strong case, based on the shared architecture, the shared fingers naming convention, and certain implications in item descriptions, that the three fingers are best understood as a suppressed, exiled, or heretical aspect of the same overarching structure that produced the two fingers, something the Golden Order and its guiding will actively worked to bury and contain, precisely because it represents an alternative, uncontrolled expression of the same raw cosmic hunger for expansion and unity that, in its tamed two fingers form, produces orderly grace and Erdtree worship. Think about it this way: both factions want mortals to become instruments of something larger than themselves. The two fingers want a mortal to become Elden Lord, subordinating individual will to the maintenance of order. The three fingers want a mortal to become Lord of Chaos, subordinating individual will entirely to flame, to a total annihilation of individuality and boundary in service of unity through fire and madness. Both are, in a sense, offering the same basic transaction: become an instrument of a greater, less individuated will in exchange for immense power. The content of what that power does with the world differs wildly. Order preserves structure, hierarchy, and a very particular, controlled form of continuity. The flame erases structure altogether, promising a kind of ultimate unity through total destruction and reformation, returning to some primal state before individuation. I find this parallel construction really telling, because it suggests that whatever the greater will actually is, at its most fundamental level, might be less about order as a specific value, and more about a hunger for a particular relationship between itself and the mortal world. Mortals as vessels, instruments, and extensions, mortal will subsumed into cosmic will. The Golden Order dresses this up in language of harmony, natural cycles, the sanctity of death, and moral rectitude. The frenzied flame strips away the dressing entirely and just presents naked. Hungry unification through fire. Two faces arguably of the same underlying appetite. Now, I do want to flag that this reading, that the three fingers are a suppressed aspect of the same greater will, rather than a wholly separate outer god, is contested. There's a competing and equally valid reading in which the frenzied flame represents a genuinely distinct outside force, perhaps predating the greater will's arrival, perhaps representing some kind of primordial chaos that existed before order was imposed on the lands between it all, similar to how the stars and the formless cult predate the Erdtree. Melina, late in the game, refers to the flame as something that should never have been brought to this world, language that suggests an intrusion from outside, rather than an internal corruption. If that's the case, then the three fingers represent a rival outer god's foothold in the same physical location the greater will uses, which would actually make the Round Table Hold's dual chambers a kind of cosmic battlefield, two competing outside forces both trying to use the same access point into the lands between, the two fingers guarding the sanctioned route above, the three fingers representing an infection or breach below. I lean personally toward a synthesis of both readings. I think the ambiguity is intentional, and I think it's meant to destabilize the player's confidence in the idea that order and chaos are cleanly opposed moral categories in this world, when really, both might be two techniques the same underlying kind of cosmic hunger uses to consume mortal agency, dressed in different aesthetics. Whether they're literally the same entity or two entities with structurally similar appetites, the thematic point lands the same way. Don't trust either one to actually care about you as an individual. Let's move now to talk about the Golden Order specifically, since this is the primary institutional expression of the Greater Will's influence in the world. The thing most players actually interact with across the entire runtime of the game, far more than they interact with the Two Fingers or the Elden Beast directly. The Golden Order as an institution was established by Queen Marika the Eternal, following what the game strongly implies was her direct communion with, or selection by, the Greater Will. Marika is described repeatedly as an Empyrean, a term the game uses for beings capable of becoming a vessel for the Elden Ring, of literally embodying a great rune and channeling divine authority into the mortal world. She was not always a queen. She began, as far as the lore hints suggest, as a mortal or near mortal being touched by the Greater Will's grace, elevated to a status where she could act as the living conduit between the god's will and mortal governance. Marika's establishment of the Golden Order involved several concrete, specific acts of world shaping that I think are worth going through individually, because each one tells us something about what order actually means in the Greater Will's project. First, the removal of destined death from the world. This is, I think, the single most consequential theological and metaphysical act in the entire backstory of Elden Ring, and it's worth spending real time on. Destined death in this cosmology is not simply dying. It's a specific cosmic principle, the guarantee that all things, including gods, including the Erd Tree itself, including order, will eventually end, decay, and be replaced. The Rune of Death item description tells us explicitly that destined death was extracted from the general fabric of the Lands Between's cosmology and sealed away, first within Malekith, and eventually within the Black Blade Ordovis, or by Malekith's own guardianship, specifically because the Greater Will wanted to protect the Elden Ring from being destroyed or ended by outside interference, or, in some readings, wanted to protect its entire project in the Lands Between from being subject to the natural cosmic law that everything, even gods, must eventually die. This is enormous. This means that the world of Elden Ring, for the vast majority of its history since Marika's ascension, has been a world without real death. At least not the kind of death that actually concludes and closes off possibility. Godwyn, Marika's son, is killed by Malekith and the Black Blade at the Night of the Black Knives, and yet he does not truly die. Instead, he lingers, rotting eternally, feeding a hideous nest of decay beneath the Erd Tree that we eventually see as the horrifying vision at Miquella's Haligtree, and later. In the Shadow of the Erd Tree expansion, connected directly to the corrupted, rotted lands of the Land of Shadow's own decayed regions. Rot itself, the scarlet rot that plagues Caelid and the Lake of Rot, is heavily implied to be a symptom or perhaps a direct consequence of Godwyn's undeath, of a death that cannot properly complete itself, festering instead of ending. Why would the Greater Will want this? Why remove death from the world at all? I think the most coherent reading, and one supported by a lot of scattered textual evidence, is that the Greater Will's core project in the Lands Between is essentially about stability and permanence, about creating a fixed, unchanging, eternal order, an order that does not decay, does not end, does not cycle back into chaos the way presumably other worlds or other eras have. The removal of destined death is an attempt to lock the current arrangement, the current order, into permanence. If nothing can truly die, including the order itself, then the order becomes, in principle, eternal. But of course, this backfires spectacularly. And this is one of the most important pieces of subtext in the whole game. The removal of destined death doesn't actually stop decay, corruption, or ending. It just prevents these processes from resolving cleanly. Instead of things dying and being replaced by something new, in a natural cycle, things rot instead. They linger in an intermediate state of decay without conclusion. Godwyn festers instead of dying. The world's overall trajectory across the game's timeline is one of increasing corruption, in the literal scarlet rot sense and in the moral/political sense, precisely because natural endings have been artificially prevented. This is, I think, one of the most sophisticated pieces of implicit world-building commentary From Software has ever done, the removal of death. Framed by the Golden Order as a sacred protective act, is actually the underlying cause of the world's slow-motion catastrophe. Order, in trying to make itself permanent by cheating death, guarantees its own eventual rot. Second major act, the establishment of the Erd Tree itself as the central structure of worship, law, and cosmological anchoring. The Erd Tree, that colossal golden tree visible from almost anywhere in the Lands Between, is not simply a big tree that happens to be pretty. It's described as growing from or being deeply entangled with the Elden Ring itself, and it functions as the physical, visible expression of the Greater Will's presence and authority in the world. Its golden light, the same light associated with grace, with the two fingers, with the guidance mechanic that literally drives the player character forward through the game, all traces back to the same source. The Erd Tree serves multiple functions simultaneously. It's a religious symbol, the object of worship for the Erd Tree faith practiced by countless NPCs, clergy, and factions throughout the game. It's a political symbol, the anchor of Lindell's authority as the capital of the Golden Order's earthly kingdom. And it's a metaphysical structure, tied directly to the Erd Tree's rule in the burial of runes, souls, and the essence of death itself, since when a being dies within the world of the Golden Order, particularly an important being tied to order, their remains or their rune can be enshrined, buried, or otherwise processed through Erd Tree-related rites, which is part of why the game's core gameplay loop of collecting runes as currency and experience is thematically loaded rather than just a mechanical abstraction. Runes are, narratively, fragments or expressions of a being's essential will and identity, and the entire economy of the game is built around harvesting, spending, and losing these fragments, which mirrors at a systemic level the exact thing the Greater Will's order is built around: the extraction and management of mortal will and essence for a larger structural purpose. Third, the creation of demigods through Marika's own reproduction and through the granting of great runes. Marika, along with her other self-husband Radagon, bore multiple children: Godwyn, Morgott, Rykard, Radon, Millennia, and Maquella, and others. Each of these children, along with a few other empowered beings, eventually received a great rune, a fragment of the Elden Ring's power, and became a demigod ruler over a specific region of the lands between, extending the Golden Order's authority outward from Lindell into every corner of the map. This structure, demigods as regional franchise holders of Order's central authority, is precisely why the game's world map is organized the way it is, with each major region dominated by a specific demigod's rule, ideology, and corruption. Caelid under Radon, Liurnia under the fractured Carrion royal family, Altus Plateau and Lindell under Morgoth, Volcano Manor under Rykard's corrupted, blasphemous rule, the consecrated Snowfield and Haligtree under Millennia and Maquella. Each of these regions represents a kind of natural experiment in what happens when a fragment of the Greater Will's cosmic authority is handed to an individual mortal-adjacent ruler and left to develop somewhat independently for centuries. And in almost every single case, that experiment ends in some form of corruption, obsession, or catastrophic failure, which is, again, I think, a very deliberate piece of thematic architecture, even when the Greater Will's authority is distributed to beings specifically chosen and empowered by it. Chosen because they were Marika's own children, invested with immense power. The results are not stability and harmony, but fragmentation, obsession, and decay. This brings us to arguably the single most important event in the entire backstory: the Shattering, the moment when Queen Marika herself broke the Elden Ring. This is the founding catastrophe of the game's entire plot, the thing that sets literally everything in motion, and it's worth asking very carefully, why did she do it? And what does it tell us about the Greater Will's relationship to its own chosen vessel? The game is characteristically indirect about Marika's exact motivations, but the strongest and most widely accepted reading, supported by dialogue from Godwyn's fragmentary appearances in Shadow of the Erdtree, by Maquella's storyline, by various item descriptions, and by the overall shape of the plot, is that Marika shattered the Elden Ring as an act of grief and rebellion following the death of her son Godwyn, killed in the Night of the Black Knives by Malekith and Ranni's co-conspirators, or by other accounts through Ranni's own machinations to escape her own fate as a potential Elden Lord candidate imposed on her by the Order. Godwyn's death, in a world where destined death had been removed, didn't produce a clean ending. It produced the horrifying, rotting undeath that plagues the world for the rest of the timeline. Marika, faced with the failure of her own foundational act, the removal of death that was supposed to make her Order eternal, and instead produced this obscene, festering wound in her own son and in the world's ecology, broke the ring itself. This is a genuinely staggering thing for the Golden Order's own chosen vessel, its living, empowered representative on Earth, to do. Marika didn't rebel against the Golden Order from outside. She was the Golden Order, its literal embodiment, and she broke its central structure from within. This act alone should tell us something crucial about the relationship between the Greater Will and even its most favored, most empowered mortal instrument. Even Marika, elevated to near godhood, granted the authority to reshape reality, was not simply a puppet with no interiority or capacity for grief, rage, and rebellion. Her shattering of the ring is, arguably, the entire game's founding proof that the Greater Will's project, however cosmic and however overwhelming its authority, cannot fully eliminate the possibility of mortal grief and defiance breaking its structures from the inside. And crucially, the Greater Will's response to this rebellion was not to strike Marika down, or to replace her, or to directly intervene and fix the ring itself. Instead, its response, mediated through the Two Fingers, was to call the Tarnished back, to summon exiles from across the lands between and beyond, and set them on a path toward possibly becoming a new Elden Lord who could restore the ring. This response is telling. The Greater Will did not simply reassert direct control. It outsourced the solution to a competition among mortals. Whether this is because the Greater Will genuinely cannot act more directly, whether it's constrained by rules of its own cosmic order that even it must respect, or whether this diffusion of responsibility is itself part of its strategy, testing multiple mortal candidates to find the one whose will is compatible with its own purposes, is left ambiguous. But either way, it establishes something crucial about how this god operates, indirectly, through competition, through the accumulation and selection of proxies, rather than through direct unilateral action. Now, this is a good moment to talk about what I think is one of the most underrated pieces of Greater Will lore in the entire game. Its apparent silence. Its absence. Throughout the actual events of the base game's plot, multiple characters remark on this. Melina, your companion for most of the game, at several points expresses uncertainty, even something like abandonment, about the Greater Will's apparent lack of guidance or active intervention. The two fingers themselves, though nominally still active in summoning and guiding Tarnished, are described by several NPCs, and by their own diminished, exhausted state, as being weaker, quieter, less vital than they presumably once were. Inia herself, the finger reader, expresses uncertainty about the clarity of what she's interpreting. Even the grace mechanic itself, while functionally guiding the player throughout the game, is narratively framed as somewhat threadbare, uncertain guidance rather than confident divine command. Why would the Greater Will be quiet during the exact period when its own chosen instrument, Marika, has broken its central structure and the entire world is descending into war and decay? There are a few possible readings here, and I don't think the game commits definitively to just one. One reading: the Greater Will's silence is itself a form of punishment, or at least consequence, for Marika's rebellion. Having broken the ring, having defied the god's project from within, perhaps the god has withdrawn its full attention, its full guiding presence, as either retribution or simply because its primary vessel, Marika, is no longer functioning as an effective conduit. If your main channel of communication and action in a world is broken, corrupted, or actively rebelling against you, your influence in that world would naturally diminish, even if your fundamental will and desires remain unchanged. A second reading, and one I find genuinely compelling: the Greater Will's silence reflects something more like exhaustion or genuine diminishment. Not merely metaphorical distance, but actual weakened capacity. Remember, the Elden beast, when you finally fight it, is a strange, almost sickly-looking creature, all sinew and thin golden light. Nothing like the overwhelming, world-dominating presence you might expect from the entity that has shaped the entire cosmology of the setting. This could support a reading in which the Greater Will itself is, for whatever reason, not operating at full strength during the events of the game, whether because of some larger cosmic conflict we're not shown, some cost extracted by centuries of maintaining its order against decay and entropy, or simply because gods in this universe are not infinite, unchanging absolutes, but entities that can weaken, tire, and become vulnerable, just as mortals do, only on a different scale and timeline. A third reading, which I think coexists productively with the first two rather than replacing them: the silence is structurally necessary for the plot's central mechanic to function at all. The entire premise of the game is that you, the player, as the Tarnished, have real agency in determining the fate of the lands between, choosing among radically different endings that range from restoring a reformed Golden Order, to embracing the Frenzied Flame, to supporting Ranni's Age of Stars, which explicitly rejects the Greater Will's involvement altogether, to several other outcomes introduced or expanded in Shadow of the Erdtree and its associated lore. For that agency to feel real and consequential, rather than predetermined, the game needs the guiding god's will to be genuinely uncertain, genuinely unclear, genuinely withdrawn enough that multiple wildly divergent outcomes are all plausible results of the same starting conditions. A fully present, fully communicative, fully commanding Greater Will would collapse this narrative possibility space. Its silence, whatever its in-universe cause, is functionally what makes the game's branching narrative structure make sense. I want to pause here and talk specifically about Melina, because she is in many ways the character who most directly embodies the player's relationship to the Greater Will's ambiguous guidance throughout the game, and her own nature and fate are deeply tied to unresolved Greater Will lore. Melina presents herself as, and is generally understood by the community to be, connected to the Greater Will's project, though the specifics of her origin are deliberately obscured. She refers to herself using unusual language, describing her existence, in one of the game's most quietly devastating pieces of dialogue, as something that was cut away or separated from something else in order to exist as she does. In order to walk alongside the Tarnished and eventually guide them to the Erdtree, where in most of the game's endings she sacrifices herself, burning as kindling to allow the player to actually access and burn the Erdtree itself, since the Erdtree, being effectively eternal and resistant to normal forms of destruction thanks to the removal of destined death. requires a very specific kind of sacrificial flame to be set alight. There's substantial fan debate and some fairly strong textual support for the theory that Melina is connected to Marika's own lost or unborn children, or is somehow an aspect split off from either Marika or from the Erdtree's own accumulated will, purpose-built or self-manifested specifically to serve this function of guiding a new Elden Lord candidate to the point of being able to burn the Erdtree down, which would then allow it to be regrown, restored, or replaced depending on the ending path chosen. If this reading is correct, Melina herself is, in a sense, another emissary of the Greater Will's project, though one whose relationship to her own assignment seems to carry more visible interiority, doubt, and even something like grief or resentment than the Two Fingers or other more purely functional servants display. Melina's arc across the base game involves a slow, quiet unraveling of confidence in what she's doing and why. She questions her own purpose. She expresses uncertainty about whether burning the Erdtree, the culmination of her entire existence and function, is actually the right thing to do, or whether it's simply the thing she was made to do, without those two things necessarily being the same. This is, I think, one of the most emotionally resonant expressions of the broader theme I've been circling around this whole video. What does it mean to be an instrument of a greater will when you have your own smaller individual will capable of doubt, grief, and even resistance? Melina is not a mindless puppet. She's presented with clear interiority, and the game gives players the option, through several different late-game branches, to prevent her sacrifice, to choose a different path that doesn't require her destruction, which is itself a significant piece of implicit commentary. The correct order-sanctioned path requires an individual will, Melina's, to be extinguished in service of the larger structural goal of destroying and allowing the Erdtree to be restored under a new Elden Lord. Refusing that path and several alternate endings is framed as a meaningful act of resistance against the presumed natural order of how this cosmic project is supposed to unfold. Let's shift now to talking about the various servant races and messenger figures explicitly and unambiguously tied to the Greater Will's project, because there's a rich ecosystem of these throughout the game, and looking at them collectively tells us a lot about how the Greater Will structures its influence across different scales and functions. The Finger Maidens, or Maiden Fingers, encountered in various dungeons and specifically in the questline surrounding Fia, the deathbed companion, are humanoid beings who serve the Two Fingers directly, tending to and subverting the process of empowering Tarnished. Fia herself is a fascinating case study, because her questline is essentially a rebellion within the Two Fingers' own ranks. She was tasked with granting the baptism that empowers a Tarnished connection to death itself, using Stolen Deathroot, but her ultimate goal, revealed across her long, obscure quest, is to subvert this process to serve the Frenzied Flame, or, in some interpretations, to serve Godwyn in the cause of restoring true death to the world, working against the very cosmic order she was ostensibly created to serve. Fia represents, in miniature, the same tension we've discussed throughout, an entity explicitly created and positioned as an instrument of the Greater Will's project, who nonetheless develops independent goals, sympathies, and even outright rebellion. The Finger Creepers, the eerie, disembodied, hand-shaped creatures you encounter throughout Nokron, the Syophor River, and other deep, ancient locations, represent a different and more ambiguous category. These seem tied more to the primeval, pre-Erdtree primeval current in stellar cosmology, and their exact relationship to the Greater Will's Finger's symbolism, given the obvious visual and naming parallel, has never been definitively clarified by the game. It's possible they represent an older, more primal ancestor form of the same essential reaching hand imagery that the Two and Three Fingers later formalize into their specific institutional roles, suggesting that fingers as a symbolic and structural motif. Hands reaching into the world from some outside cosmic source predates even the Greater Will's specific arrival, and may be a more universal feature of how outer gods in general interface with the lands between. Each outer god developing its own hand reaching into the world to gather and direct mortal instruments. Then there's kindling, the concept and mechanic underlying Melina's function, and by extension, the broader mechanic by which the Erdtree, and by extension the Greater Will's central structure, can be set alight and implicitly renewed. The idea that the Erdtree requires a specific sacrificial flame of frenzy tempered by a very particular grace or similar specialized fire to actually burn, given its otherwise near total resistance to normal destruction thanks to the removal of destined death, tells us something important. The Greater Will's structures are not actually eternal or invincible in an absolute sense. They can be ended, but only through very specific, ritually significant means that are themselves, interestingly, bound up with sacrifice, love, and willing self-destruction on the part of a being connected to the Order's own project. This mirrors, thematically, the broader pattern we've seen. The Order's stability depends on channeling individual mortal wills, and even individual mortal deaths into its structure. Even its own ending, its own destruction, has to be accomplished through the same basic mechanism of sacrifice that underlies its entire operation. I also want to talk about the Erd Tree avatars, the massive tree trunk-legged guardian creatures found throughout Erd Tree-aligned territories, and the Erd Tree's broader ecosystem of servant creatures. The land squirts, the various golden-hued fauna and flora that seem to be direct biological or quasi-biological expressions of the Erd Trees, and by extension, the greater wills. Life-generating power. These creatures represent the more mundane ecological end of the greater will's influence. Not messengers or emissaries with independent will and doubt, but essentially biological extensions of the Order's structure. Gardeners and guardians without the complicating interiority we see in Melina or Fia. This range from purely mechanical servant creatures to fully conscious, doubt-capable emissaries like Melina illustrates a spectrum of instrumentality running throughout the Greater Will's entire project, and I think that spectrum itself is thematically important. The Order needs both mindless maintenance functions and willing, conscious agents. And the tragedy of the plot largely emerges from what happens when the conscious agents start to develop or reveal wills of their own that don't perfectly align with the function they were built or chosen to serve. Now let's talk in detail about Radagon, because Radagon's identity and function are absolutely essential to understanding how the Greater Will's authority is actually structured and exercised in the world. And his story is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of characterization in the entire game once you actually piece it together. Radagon and Marika are, in a sense that the game only reveals gradually and somewhat obliquely, the same being, or at least two expressions, two halves, of a single divine identity, unified by the same soul or the same fundamental essence, split or doubled in order to fulfill different functions simultaneously. Marika, associated with gold, with the feminine, with the Erd Tree, with the founding and maintenance of the Order as its stationary, central authority in Lindel. Radagon, associated with a more mobile, more militarily and diplomatically active role, married at different points to both Renala, Queen of the Full Moon in Liurnia, and to Marika / himself in some sense, fighting on the front lines, forging political alliances, functioning as the Order's active enforcer and diplomat across the lands between, distinct from Marika's largely stationary, symbolic, priestly presence in the capital. This two-ness, the doubled or split nature of Marika Radagon, is not incidental flavor. I think it's one of the most important structural clues to the Greater Will's actual metaphysical priorities in the entire game. The number 2, and the concept of duality, recur constantly throughout Elden Ring's iconography and mechanics. The two fingers themselves, the doubled nature of Marika / Radagon, the twin demigods Morgott and Mohg, the twin demigods Malenia and Makella, the recurring motif of compound or doubled identities throughout the setting. This suggests that duality, specifically, holds some kind of special metaphysical or theological significance within the Greater Will's cosmology, distinct from unity and distinct from the raw multiplicity of individual disconnected mortal wills. One compelling interpretation, and this is admittedly moving into somewhat more speculative territory even by the standards of Elden Ring lore analysis, is that the Greater Will's core project is specifically about maintaining productive tension, balance, and structure through controlled duality, rather than either total unification or total fragmentation. Order requires difference held in relationship, not sameness and not total separation. Marika and Radagon, one stationary and priestly, one mobile and martial, together form a functional whole capable of both founding and maintaining an empire in ways neither could alone. The two fingers themselves, as guides, seem to operate through a similarly balanced dual structure. Marika's shattering of the Elden Ring, then, can be read not just as an act of maternal grief, but as a rupture in this fundamental structural principle of controlled duality itself. By breaking the ring, and by extension breaking her own unified Marika Radagon self, Marika didn't just break a magic ring. She broke the fundamental structural principle, controlled, purposeful duality, that the entire Golden Order, and by extension the Greater Will's whole project in the lands between, was built around. This is why I think the final boss fight against Radagon and then the Elden Beast carries the emotional and thematic weight it does. You're not just defeating the bad guy. You're witnessing and ultimately concluding the final unraveling of a structural principle, controlled duality maintaining order against both total unification and total fragmentation. That has defined this entire cosmology since its founding. Radagon fighting desperately, almost mechanically, still trying to physically hold the order together through sheer martial force, even though the woman he's inseparable from, Marika, has already essentially given up on the project and shattered its central symbol. Marika herself, present but strangely passive, weeping, seemingly aware that whatever comes next is beyond her ability to control or direct. And then, immediately after, the Elden Beast itself, cold, indifferent, functioning according to whatever cosmic logic it still retains, regardless of the human demigod drama that's just concluded in front of it. I think this sequencing, Radagon then Elden Beast, back to back, without a break, is one of the most thematically loaded structural choices in the entire game. You defeat the desperate, tragic, still humanish attempt to hold the old order together by force, and then, immediately, you're confronted with the actual cosmic entity underneath all of it. Revealed as something that was never fully human in its motivations or investment to begin with, something that will apparently continue to exist and continue to exert influence on the world regardless of what happens to any of its individual mortal or demigod instruments. Marika can grieve. Radagon can fight desperately and tragically. But the Elden Beast, the Greater Will's own closest approximation to a true form, simply persists indifferent until you personally, mechanically, end its physical presence in the world through combat. Now let's talk about what happens after you defeat the Elden Beast, because the game's ending sequence is where a lot of the most direct, if still oblique, statements about the Greater Will's ultimate nature and fate get made, and the different endings offer genuinely different perspectives on what victory over or alongside this entity actually means. In the standard Age of the Erd Tree or Restore the Golden Order ending path, the player becomes the new Elden Lord, and the Elden Ring is restored, typically incorporating whatever specific runes or additional elements you've gathered throughout your journey, shaping the specific character and content of the new order that emerges. This is presented in the game's own framing as at least a partial success from the Greater Will's perspective. Its core structural goal, a stable, centralized order anchored to a whole Elden Ring, held by a legitimate Elden Lord, has been achieved. But even here, the game is careful not to present this as an unambiguously happy ending. The world remains scarred by centuries of war, rot, and suffering. The specific character of the restored order depends heavily on player choices and the specific ending variant achieved, meaning success from the Greater Will's structural perspective can still coexist with wildly different actual outcomes for the people living in that restored world. From something resembling genuine renewal to something closer to a colder, more totalizing restoration of hierarchical control. The Lord of Frenzied Flame ending represents the most direct rejection and inversion of the Greater Will's entire project. Rather than restoring order, the player becomes a vessel for the Three Fingers opposing force, unleashing the flame of frenzy to consume the entire lands between in indiscriminate, purifying, world-ending fire. This ending is framed, narratively, as horrifying, a genuine catastrophe rather than a liberation, though it's worth noting that some strands of community interpretation read it more ambiguously, as a kind of ultimate radical equality achieved through total destruction, erasing all the hierarchies, all the suffering, all the accumulated injustice of the Golden Order's centuries of rule, along with everything else, an equality of ash. Ranni's Age of Stars ending is, I'd argue, the most direct and complete rejection specifically of the Greater Will's involvement in the lands between, as opposed to the Frenzied Flame's rejection of order specifically, while still operating within a similar basic framework of become an instrument of an overwhelming cosmic force. Ranni's path involves severing the lands between from the Greater Will's influence entirely, embracing instead the older pre-Erdtree cosmology of the stars and the primeval current, choosing a kind of quiet, distant, non-interventionist divinity over the overwhelming, structuring presence of the Greater Will's order. This ending is framed, in most interpretations, as the closest thing the game offers to genuine liberation from the entire Greater Will versus individual will dynamic that structures so much of the rest of the game's thematic content. Rather than choosing which cosmic force to serve, order or flame, Ranni's path chooses distance, autonomy, and a much lighter, less totalizing form of governance. The various expanded endings introduced through updates and through Shadow of the Erdtree's additional lore including paths connected to Godwin, to Maquella, and to the concept of a Duskborn or differently configured order. Each add further nuance and further specific variations on this basic set of thematic choices. Restore order in some form, reject order entirely through flame, or step outside the entire order-flame binary through distance and autonomy. I won't go through each of these exhaustively since our focus here is specifically the greater will itself, but I do want to flag that this proliferation of endings, each representing a genuinely different relationship to the greater will's project, is itself a piece of evidence for something I mentioned earlier. Whatever this god actually wants, whatever its deepest motivations are, the game deliberately refuses to resolve them into a single, clear, textually confirmed answer. It gives us structural clues, thematic patterns, and consistent behavioral evidence, but it never gives us a monologue, a direct statement of purpose, a clean answer to the question, what does the greater will actually want, and why? I think this is a deliberate authorial choice, consistent with From Software's broader approach to lore across all their Soulsborne titles. But I think it's worth asking, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, why this particular approach to divine motivation, opacity, indirection, silence feels so effective and so resonant specifically in Elden Ring's case. I'd argue it's because the opacity of the greater will's motivations is not just a mystery box withholding satisfying answers for their own sake. It's thematically load-bearing. The entire emotional and narrative arc of the game, for essentially every major character we encounter, Marika, Radagon, Godwin, Ranni, Melina, Malenia, Maquella, Morgott, Mohg, Rykard, Radon, even relatively minor NPCs like Fia, Goldmask, Hyetta, Millicent, is fundamentally about the struggle to determine one's own relationship to a cosmic authority whose true will, whose actual desires and priorities, can never be fully known or verified. Every single one of these characters has constructed some interpretation, some theology, some personal relationship to what the greater will wants, or to how they should relate to order more broadly. And in almost every single case, that interpretation is at least partially wrong, incomplete, self-serving, or eventually shattered by events that reveal the gap between their belief and the actual cold, structural reality underneath. Goldmask, for instance, dedicates his entire existence to compiling a new law, an attempt to systematize and perfect the Golden Order's legal and theological structure through pure logical rigor. And yet the game gives us very little indication that this project has any actual connection to or blessing from the greater will itself. It might be, in the harshest reading, simply a mortal's obsessive attempt to impose additional clarity and rigor on a system whose actual foundational authority remains fundamentally opaque and unverifiable, a very sophisticated form of guesswork dressed in the language of certainty. Malenia and Maquella's entire tragic arc, their attempt to overcome Malenia's scarlet rot affliction, Maquella's eventual turn toward increasingly desperate and morally compromised methods to try to save his sister, and more broadly, to construct a competing vision of order built around compassion and control rather than Marika's colder, more distant model, represents another attempt by mortal-adjacent beings to interpret, extend, or even rival the greater will's authority without ever having direct, unmediated access to what that authority actually wants or sanctions. Even Marika herself, the greater will's own chosen, most intimately connected vessel, someone who presumably had more access to and understanding of the god's will than literally anyone else in the setting, ultimately shattered the entire project in grief and seemingly in a kind of theological crisis of her own, suggesting that even the closest possible mortal relationship to this entity does not guarantee clarity, comfort, or confidence in the rightness of its project. This is, I think, the deepest and most resonant thematic core of the greater will as a piece of game design and narrative construction. It's a portrait of what it's like to live under an authority, a structure, a greater will of whatever kind, political, religious, familial, institutional, whose actual intentions you can never fully verify, whose silence you have to interpret, whose apparent abandonment or distance you have to somehow reconcile with continued faith, obedience, rebellion, or some complicated mixture of all three. Every character in this game is, in their own way, wrestling with the same fundamental question the player is implicitly wrestling with across the entire runtime. What do you do when the guiding authority you've structured your entire existence around goes quiet, and you're left holding a fragment of its power, a great rune, a title, a role, a belief system, with no way of confirming whether continuing to serve it, rebel against it, or walk away from it entirely is the correct response, because the entity itself will never simply tell you. I want to close this deep dive by returning to the Elden Beast one more time, because I think the final boss fight, more than any single piece of item text or NPC dialogue, crystallizes everything we've discussed. When you finally strike down the Elden Beast, after Radagon, after everything, the immediate aftermath, depending on your ending path, ranges from quiet triumph to ambiguous horror to outright catastrophe. But regardless of which ending you pursue, one thing remains constant across all of them. You have killed a god, or at least the closest physical approximation of a god's presence that this world has ever offered you access to. And the world does not stop, does not resolve into simple clarity, does not suddenly reveal the true meaning of everything that's happened. Instead, a new configuration begins, shaped by your specific choices, your specific alliances, your specific interpretation of what should happen next, layered onto a foundation whose deepest, truest motivations you, the player, like every character in this story, never actually got to fully understand. That, I think, is the ultimate statement Elden Ring makes about the greater will, and maybe about cosmic authority in general. As explored through this particular fictional lens, it is powerful enough to shape an entire world's history, religion, politics, and metaphysics for centuries, indirect enough that its true motivations remain permanently uncertain even to its most devoted and most intimately connected servants, and, in the end, vulnerable enough, physical enough, embodied enough in the strange, alien form of the Elden Beast that a single determined mortal, risen from exile, guided by fragments and uncertain grace, can walk up to it and end its presence in the world entirely, for better or worse, leaving behind not resolution, but a new beginning shaped by mortal hands, mortal choices, and mortal imperfect will. Before we get to the final wrap-up, I want to slow down and spend a long stretch of time on several pieces of this puzzle I've only touched on so far, because I don't think you can really claim to understand the greater will without understanding, in detail, the other cosmic forces it exists alongside, the specific mechanics of the Golden Order as a lived religion, rather than just a political structure, and the specific fates of the individual demigods, since each of their stories is in effect a separate experiment the game runs on the question of what happens when the greater will's authority is inherited, distributed, and eventually left to operate without clear central guidance. Let's start with the Erd Tree faith as an actual lived religious practice, because I skipped past this fairly quickly earlier, and I think it deserves much closer attention. Throughout the lands between, you encounter countless NPCs, invaders, cooperative phantoms, and background characters who identify as followers of the Erd Tree faith, praying at Erd Tree-aligned sites of grace, wielding sacred affinity weapons, casting incantations drawn from the teachings of the Golden Order, the Two Fingers, or specific saints and martyrs within that tradition. This isn't just flavor text. The game actually gives us a fairly granular picture of how this faith is structured, who its various competing schools and sects are, and how those sects relate differently to the greater will's actual underlying authority. The core Erd Tree faith, as taught and practiced in Lindell and by most of the game's Erd Tree-aligned NPCs, centers on reverence for the Erd Tree itself as the physical anchor of divine grace, obedience to the Golden Order's law, and a set of incantations that draw on themes of protection, healing, and radiant, purifying damage. Gold and light used as both literal and metaphorical weapons against corruption, rot, and disorder. This is the mainstream theology, the one most explicitly sanctioned by the existing power structure in Lindell, taught by clergy who served directly under the authority that, until Morgott's death, was nominally still presented to the outside world as Godfrey's unbroken, ongoing rule. Even though Godfrey himself had long since been exiled, and the throne was actually being secretly held by Morgott behind an illusion. But there are meaningful splinter traditions. The Golden Order fundamentalist sect, associated specifically with the Erd Tree's more militant, purity-obsessed wing, and heavily featured in Lindell's later, more embattled areas, represents a harder, more violent interpretation of the same basic theology, one less interested in the more contemplative, healing-oriented aspects of mainstream Erd Tree worship, and more interested in aggressive suppression of anything coded as impure, omen, rot-touched, or otherwise deviant from the strict order the fundamentalists believe the greater will demands. This sect's very existence tells us something important. Even within a single overarching faith built around a single divine authority, mortal interpreters diverge, sometimes violently, on what that authority actually requires, with the fundamentalists erring toward the harsher, more punitive end of the interpretive spectrum, persecuting Omen, hunting down anything they deem heretical, essentially radicalizing the underlying theology into something closer to zealotry. Then there's the theology and practice associated with Maquella specifically, which by the time of the base game's events has already effectively become its own semi-independent tradition, centered on the Haligtree, on themes of compassion, healing, and the curing of affliction, particularly Millennia's Rot, but which, as we learn in much greater and much darker detail through the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion, eventually curdles into something far more troubling. Maquella's project of achieving what he calls true, unconditional love, pursued through methods that increasingly involve manipulation, coercion, and a kind of theological megalomania in which Maquella essentially attempts to construct his own competing godhood, his own rival access point to Elden Ring-style authority, independent of and eventually in direct competition with the structures Marika originally established. Maquella's arc deserves real attention here, because I think it's the single clearest example the game gives us of a mortal adjacent being attempting to seize or replicate the Greater Will's authority for themselves, rather than simply serving as an instrument or interpreter of that authority. Where Marika was, as far as we can tell, actually chosen and elevated by the Greater Will itself. Maquella's path toward comparable god-like influence appears to be self-directed, self-willed, achieved through his own extraordinary charm, his own accumulated followers, his own manipulation of beings like Mog and, in the expansion's climax, Radon himself, whose corpse Maquella essentially repurposes as a vessel, stitching his own consciousness and purpose onto Radon's resurrected, radically altered body in an attempt to finally achieve his ascension and become a new god, a rival to the very system that shaped him. The thematic point here is enormously important. Maquella's entire project is, in a sense, a mortal's attempt to become a greater will of his own, to construct a new cosmic authority built around his own specific values, compassion, unconditional love. The elimination of suffering and affliction, but pursued through exactly the same fundamental technique the Greater Will itself uses throughout the base game. The instrumentalization of other beings' will, consent, and autonomy in service of a larger, supposedly benevolent project. Mog's forced devotion, Radon's repurposed corpse. The various followers and knights who become swept up in Maquella's charismatic orbit throughout the Land of Shadow. All of this echoes, almost exactly, the basic structural logic of the Golden Order itself. Individual wills subordinated, consumed, or overwritten in service of a greater, ostensibly more important cosmic project. Maquella doesn't escape the Greater Will's basic logic by rebelling against it. He reproduces that exact logic, just redirected toward his own specific ends, which I think is one of the most devastating and sophisticated critiques buried anywhere in this entire narrative. Even a being motivated by what he sincerely believes is compassion and love ends up recreating the exact same fundamental pattern of consumption and instrumentalization that defines the cosmic authority he's ostensibly trying to surpass or improve upon. Now let's talk about the Formless Mother, because understanding her and understanding the Omen and the Deathbirds gives us an extremely useful point of contrast for understanding what makes the Greater Will's specific approach to cosmic authority distinctive, by showing us what a different Outer Gods approach looks like. The Formless Mother is associated primarily with Fia's questline, with the Deathbird enemies scattered throughout the world, and with the broader phenomenon of the Omen, the horned-tailed beings born throughout the Golden Order's territory, who are systematically hidden, imprisoned, or killed by the Order specifically because their existence contradicts and embarrasses the Order's foundational mythology. Here's the crucial piece of lore. Omen are not some external threat or invasive species. They are, according to the game's own scattered lore, the true, original, unbroken birthright of humanity in the lands between, tied to destined death itself, to the natural cycle of true, complete death and rebirth that the Golden Order specifically worked to suppress and hide when Marika removed destined death from the world. When the Order pulled death out of the natural cycle, when it began sealing away and denying the basic mortal reality of a complete natural ending, something had to be done with the parts of that natural cycle that no longer fit the sanitized, order-appropriate story the Golden Order wanted to tell about itself. The Omen, marked by horns and tails, are, essentially, the visible, physical evidence of what natural humanity actually is in this cosmology, evidence the Order found so embarrassing, so contradictory to its self-image, that it has spent centuries hiding Omen away in sewers beneath Lindell, murdering Omen infants, and building an entire aesthetic and moral framework around treating Omen-marked beings as monstrous, cursed, or subhuman, when in fact, if the lore is read correctly, They may represent something closer to the actual, unmodified truth about mortal nature in this world, prior to the Golden Order's centuries of selective breeding, mythologizing, and enforced conformity to its specific golden, hornless, purified ideal of what a proper subject of the Order should look like. Morgott himself, of course, is the game's central tragic example of this dynamic. Born an Omen, one of Marika's own children, hidden and humiliated for it despite his lineage, eventually forced to essentially self-mutilate, filing down his own horns, adopting the guise of Godfrey to secretly rule Lindell from behind an illusion because his own mother's order could not tolerate the truth of what he actually was standing openly at the center of its capital. This is, I think, one of the most powerful indictments of the Golden Order's actual moral character contained anywhere in the game's lore, more powerful than any abstract philosophical point. The Order's own founder's own son, an Omen, had to hide his own body, physically alter himself, and rule in secret and in shame. Precisely because the Order Marika built could not accommodate the visible truth of what her own removal of destined death had actually done to the natural order of birth and mortality in this world. The formless mother, then, represents an outer god, or at minimum an outside cosmic force, whose domain is specifically the suppressed, hidden, denied aspect of natural mortality, the Omen, Deathroot, the natural cycle of true death that the Greater Will's Order specifically worked to remove and hide. Fia's entire questline, her secret nurturing of Deathroot, and her ultimate goal of using this material to somehow restore natural death, and by extension something like natural justice, to the lands between, positions the Formless Mother's project as, in a real sense, diametrically opposed to and corrective of the specific damage the Greater Will's Order has done to this world's fundamental cosmological structure. This comparison is incredibly clarifying, I think, for understanding the Greater Will's specific character among the Outer Gods, because it shows us a god whose entire project can be read, at least in part, as an act of denial, suppression, and cosmetic beautification imposed over an uglier, more complicated natural reality. Gold and light and order laid over the top of decay, mortality, and difference, hiding and punishing anything that visibly contradicts the polished self-image the Order wants to project, while the Formless Mother's domain represents everything that got pushed underground, literally, into the sewers beneath Lindell, and figuratively into the margins of the setting's official mythology as a consequence of that suppression. Let's also spend real time on the Frenzied Flame in more detail, because I gave it a fairly abstract treatment earlier and it deserves a much more concrete accounting, since it's genuinely one of the most distinct and frightening cosmic forces in the entire setting, and understanding it in detail sharpens our understanding of the Greater Will, by contrast. The Frenzied Flame, according to its own in-game item descriptions and the environmental storytelling around Shallona's monastery, the shunning grounds beneath Lindell where the Three Fingers reside, and the windmill village that's been entirely consumed by frenzy, is described repeatedly using language of the world uniting as one, a hunger, a burning desire specifically to erase the boundaries, distinctions, and separations between individual beings, collapsing them all into a single screaming, burning mass of undifferentiated flame and madness. This is explicitly, textually, framed as an alien, outside force, something that intrudes into the lands between from beyond, an outer god in the community's own shorthand usage, but crucially one whose core desire, unification, erasure of individual boundaries and distinctions, sits in fascinating, almost mirror image relationship to the Greater Will's own apparent desire for controlled duality in hierarchical structured order, where the Greater Will wants difference maintained but subordinated, individual wills folded into a larger structure while nominally still distinct, retaining rank, role, an identity within a hierarchy. The Frenzied Flame wants difference erased entirely, all beings burned down into an undifferentiated, screaming totality with no hierarchy, no rank, no distinction remaining at all, a horrifying kind of equality achieved purely through total, indiscriminate consumption. Both are, in their own ways, responses to the same underlying anxiety about individual, ungoverned mortal will. The Greater Will tries to manage and structure it, subordinating it within a hierarchy. The Frenzied Flame tries to eliminate the problem entirely by erasing individuality as a category altogether. Let me solo her, jokes aside. Millennia herself carries a small, contained fragment of the Frenzied Flame's essence within her own body, granted or somehow bound to her, alongside her Scarlet Rot affliction, which produces her final, horrifying transformation in the second phase of her boss fight, the goddess of rot form, where flame and rot combine into something that reads visually and thematically as a kind of horrifying synthesis of two different corruptions of the same underlying cosmic template, the template being essentially an outer god's hunger operating without the Golden Order's normal channels of control and mediation. This detail, small as it is within the broader scope of her character, actually connects Millennia directly to both of the game's two clearest examples of outer god corruption, rot and frenzy, running through the exact same body, making her, in a sense, a living intersection point of multiple different cosmic forces the Greater Will's Order has tried, and largely failed, to contain, suppress, or cure. Now let's talk in real depth about Rani and the lunar stellar cosmology she represents, because her arc offers the single most fully developed alternative model of divinity and cosmic authority anywhere in the game. And contrasting it point by point with the Greater Will's model tells us an enormous amount about what makes the Greater Will's specific approach to godhood distinctive. Rani, technically a demigod, granted the Great Rune of Death after Godwin's murder at her orchestration, rejects her assigned role within the Golden Order's succession structure almost immediately. She discards her own body, abandoning it as a doll-like puppet, specifically because she does not want to become Elden Lord, does not want to inherit or perpetuate the Golden Order's structure of centralized Erdtree-anchored authority in any form. Rani's own theology, as we piece it together across her long, elaborate quest line, centers on the Age of Stars, a return to, or evolution of, the older, pre-Erdtree cosmology associated with the primeval currents, the eternal cities of Nokron and Nokstella, and the ancient pre-Marika civilization that worshipped the stars rather than a singular, centralized golden tree. Rani's specific plan involves severing the Elden Ring's connection to destined death permanently, reclaiming the concept of natural, complete death for the lands between, and establishing a new form of governance modeled on the distant, indirect, largely non-interventionist relationship the moon and stars have traditionally had with the world, as opposed to the Erdtree's constant, overwhelming, centralized presence looming visible from every corner of the map. The thematic contrast here is incredibly precise, and I think deliberately constructed by the game's writers. The Erdtree is huge, golden, visible from literally everywhere, an inescapable totalizing presence that structures the entire visual and political landscape of the lands between. The moon, by contrast, is distant, quiet, visible but not overwhelming, present but not dominating. Associated throughout the game with subtlety, secrecy, careful long-term planning, and crucially, an explicit rejection of the entire logic of centralized, singular divine authority around which the Greater Will's whole project is organized. Rani doesn't want to become a new version of Marika. She wants a fundamentally different relationship between divinity and mortal governance altogether, quieter, more distant, granting individual beings, demigods, mortals, tarnished, more genuine autonomy rather than folding them into a hierarchical structure built around obedience to a single, centralized, overwhelming authority. This is why Rani's ending is so frequently discussed as the closest thing the game offers to a genuinely hopeful or at least genuinely novel conclusion, as opposed to the other endings, which either restore some version of the existing centralized authority structure or replace it with an equally totalizing, equally consuming alternative. Rani's path represents an attempt to step outside the entire framework of which overwhelming cosmic force do you serve altogether, choosing instead a model of distant, minimal, largely hands-off divine presence that, whatever its own risks and uncertainties, offers a genuine alternative to the basic order versus chaos, controlled duality versus total unification binary that structures most of the rest of the game's cosmological choices. Let's turn now to a detailed accounting of the demigods and what each of their specific stories tells us about the Greater Will's authority once it's distributed outward from the center and left to operate somewhat independently across the different regions of the lands between. Because I think this is one of the richest and most underexplored angles for understanding the practical consequences of the Greater Will's basic project. Godric the Grafted, ruling over Stormvale and the Limgrave region, represents perhaps the most degraded, most desperate example of inherited authority in the entire game. Not one of Mareka's actual children, Godric is a lesser scion of the Golden Lineage, granted a fragment of authority in a great rune despite his relatively weak claim, and his entire character arc, his grotesque practice of literally grafting the limbs of defeated enemies onto his own body in a desperate attempt to compensate for his own perceived genetic and martial inadequacy, reads as a horrifying, literalized metaphor for what happens when someone without a strong, secure claim to the greater will's delegated authority tries to compensate for that insecurity through brute, grafted together, cobbled together power. Godric's grotesqueness isn't just body horror for its own sake. It's a direct visual expression of the anxiety and inadequacy that runs underneath the entire structure of inherited, delegated divine authority the Golden Order relies on. Rinola, Queen of the Full Moon, ruling over the Academy of Raya Lucaria in Liurnia, represents a fascinating hybrid case, married to Radagon. Rinola's own domain, sorcery, the moon, the Academy's obsessive pursuit of magical knowledge and true magic or full moon sorcery, represents an institution that has, in a sense, already partially defected from strict Golden Order orthodoxy toward the lunar stellar cosmology Rani later champions more completely. Rinola's own devastating grief and eventual withdrawal into a kind of ritualized madness, following Radagon's abandonment of her and their children to return to Marika and the Golden Order's central project, is presented as one of the most quietly heartbreaking consequences of the Greater Will's structural priorities, a family, a marriage. Treated as expendable and reconfigurable in service of the larger cosmic project, with Rinola left to process the wreckage largely alone, for centuries at the heart of an institution, the Academy, that continues to nominally operate within the Golden Order's broader framework even as its own scholarly traditions increasingly point toward alternatives to that framework. Radon, ruling over Caelid, presents yet another angle, a demigod whose power was so overwhelming, so specifically tied to control over gravity and the stars, that he was able to literally stop millennia's scarlet rot from spreading by essentially locking himself and his opponent in an endless, unresolved battle, a battle so cosmically significant it apparently required his eventual descent into bestial madness, losing his own mind and humanity, becoming the half-beast, half-god Starscourge Radon we actually fight, specifically to contain a threat, millennia's rot, that is itself, as we've discussed, a direct symptom of the Greater Will's own removal of destined death from the world. Radon's entire tragic arc is, in other words, a demigod sacrificing his own mind and body specifically to contain collateral damage caused by his own mother figures, or at least his own order's foundational cosmological decision. He becomes a wall holding back a flood that the dam upstream, the Golden Order itself, caused in the first place. Rykard, ruling over Volcano Manor and Ent. Gelmir represents perhaps the most extreme and explicit rejection of Golden Order orthodoxy among the demigods, having consumed the god-devouring serpent and transformed himself into a monstrous, blasphemous hybrid, being specifically as an act of defiance against his mother Mareka's authority and the entire theological structure she built. Rykard's path, seeking power specifically through consumption of a rival divine entity, the god-devouring serpent, itself possibly connected to yet another distinct outer god or divine bloodline entirely, represents a demigod attempting to escape the Greater Will's structure, not through Rani's careful, patient severance, and not through Miquella's attempt to build a rival parallel structure, but through the far cruder, more violent method of simply consuming a different source of divine power, and using it to openly defy and mock the very order that raised and empowered him, running a cult of assassins and hedonists out of Volcano Manor that operates as an explicit inversion of the Erdtree faith's values. Moog, Lord of Blood. Ruling in secret beneath Lindell in the Mogwin Palace deep within the rot-flooded, dragon-barrow-riddled consecrated snowfield's opposite region, represents yet another variant. A demigod who, having been born in Omen alongside his twin Morgoth, and having presumably suffered similar persecution and humiliation, eventually turns not toward the formless mother's domain but toward his own. Entirely separate blood-based cosmology, the formless mother connection is actually present here too through the Bloodlord's own affiliation, but filtered through Moog's specific obsession with the blessing of the Bloody Finger and with grooming Miquella as a potential vessel for his own attempt to become a new god of blood, ruling from the hidden, rot and blood-soaked Mogwin Palace, itself explicitly connected to the same underlying decay and suppressed death cosmology we discussed with the Omen and the Formless Mother. And then there's Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, whose story I haven't discussed in detail yet and who deserves real attention because he represents the single clearest, most literal embodiment of what the Greater Will's structure requires and then discards. Godfrey was not one of Marika's divine children. He was, as far as the lore suggests, essentially a mortal, or at least a being much closer to ordinary mortality, chosen and elevated by Marika specifically because of his martial prowess and his capacity to serve as her general, her sword arm, the one who actually conquered and unified the lands between under the Golden Order's banner through generations of warfare. He becomes the first Elden Lord specifically because Marika needed someone to physically enact and enforce the Order's expansion, and he does this job by all accounts extraordinarily well, becoming legendary, beloved, respected across the entire setting even centuries after his exile. And then, once his usefulness in that specific martial capacity was exhausted, once the wars of conquest were largely won and the Order needed to shift towards stability and administration rather than expansion, Marika exiled him, simply cast him out, ended their marriage, and moved the Order's structure of power away from the martial, conquering energy Godfrey represented and toward a different configuration entirely. Godfrey's exile, decades or centuries before the game's main events, and his eventual, painful, humiliating renewal into Hora Lu warrior, stripped of his golden lordship and forced to rediscover his own base, animalistic martial power outside the sanctioned structure of the Order entirely, represents perhaps the starkest possible illustration of the Greater Will's fundamentally instrumental relationship even to its own most successful, most effective chosen champions. You are useful until you are not, and then you are discarded, regardless of your service, your devotion, or your love. I think laying out all these demigod stories side by side like this, Godrick's grotesque inadequacy, Renala's abandonment and grief, Radon's self-sacrifice to contain collateral damage from the Order's own foundational sin, Rykard's crude, violent rejection through consumption of a rival power, Mohg's twisted attempt to build his own blood cosmology, Miquella's far more sophisticated and far more disturbing attempt to construct an entire rival godhood built on love that curdles into coercion, and Godfrey's simple, brutal discarding once his usefulness expired gives us an incredibly comprehensive, damning portrait of what actually happens, generation after generation, region after region, to beings who are granted fragments of the Greater Will's authority and then left largely to their own devices. Almost none of them end up in a stable, healthy relationship to that inherited power. Almost all of them end up consumed by it, twisted by it, or destroyed by their own attempts to escape, rival, or compensate for its terms. I want to spend some more time now on a question I raised earlier, but didn't fully resolve. What, if anything, does the Greater Will actually get out of all of this? What is the actual positive content of its project? Beyond the purely structural observation that it seems to want centralized order maintained around the Elden Ring, is there anything closer to a motive, an actual desire that we can extract from the evidence the game gives us? I think the closest we get to an answer comes from thinking carefully about the relationship between the Elden Ring itself and the broader implied cosmology of multiple worlds, multiple realities, that the game gestures toward without ever making fully explicit. The Elden Ring is described, and its very shape and function suggest something closer to a law or a governing structure that binds and organizes reality within the lands between specifically, a kind of localized cosmological operating system, if you'll forgive the somewhat clinical metaphor, that the Greater Will maintains and cultivates. The removal of destined death, the emphasis on centralized, singular, structured authority, and the sheer scale and permanence the Greater Will seems to want for its project all suggest something like cosmic gardening. The Greater Will is cultivating a specific kind of stable, ordered, structured reality in the lands between, for reasons that remain fundamentally opaque to us, but which might have to do with some larger project spanning multiple worlds or realities, of which the lands between is simply one carefully tended plot. This would explain why the Greater Will seems to care intensely about structure and permanence as such, more than about any specific moral or ideological content within that structure. If you're cultivating something across a vast timescale, for purposes that operate on a genuinely cosmic, possibly multi-world scale, you might well prioritize the mere existence of stable, ordered structure over the specific ethical or political character of that structure. The same way a gardener cares more that a particular plot of land continues producing whatever the desired crop is, than about the specific experiences or feelings of the individual plants growing there. This reading is speculative, I want to be clear about that. More speculative than most of what I've said in this video, because the game genuinely does not confirm or deny anything about multi-world cosmic gardening as a literal motive. But I think it's the reading that best accounts for the specific pattern of evidence we do have. An entity that prioritizes structural permanence over specific content, that operates through indirect, competitive, almost experimental methods rather than direct, controlling intervention. And that appears through the design and demeanor of the Elden Beast itself. To be something closer to an alien intelligence pursuing incomprehensible, non-human scaled priorities than to a god who loves or cares about its subjects in anything resembling the way the Golden Order's official theology claims. Let's talk finally, before we wrap up, about what all of this means for the Tarnished, for the player character specifically. Because I think there's a real irony worth sitting with in how this all resolves at the mechanical and narrative level of the actual game you play. You, the Tarnished, are perhaps the single clearest, most literal embodiment of instrumentality in the entire game. You were exiled from the lands between generations ago, your grace extinguished. Specifically because you failed some earlier iteration of this exact same process, the search for a viable Elden Lord candidate. You were called back, not because the Two Fingers know anything specific and reassuring about you as an individual, but because the Shattering created an emergency, and emergencies require casting a wide net, gathering as many potential candidates as possible, and letting circumstance, combat, and the accumulation of runes determine who actually succeeds. You are, from the very first cutscene of the game, explicitly framed as one candidate among an enormous number of other Tarnished, most of whom, as you discover throughout your playthrough, either die, go mad, or become the various NPC invaders and antagonists scattered throughout the world, failed or corrupted instruments of the exact same basic process you're currently undergoing successfully. And yet, despite this thoroughly instrumentalized framing, despite being explicitly one candidate among countless others, explicitly called back and guided by an entity whose true motivations you can never verify, explicitly walking a path shaped by grace that you did not choose and cannot fully control, the game's entire branching ending structure insists, mechanically and narratively, that your specific choices, who you ally with, whose sacrifice you accept or refuse, which great runes you gather, which of the wildly divergent endings you ultimately pursue, actually matter, actually shape the specific character of whatever comes next for the lands between. I think this tension between total instrumentality and genuine consequential individual agency is the single most important thing Elden Ring's plot, mechanics, and lore are all working together to express. It's not a contradiction the game is failing to resolve. I think it's the actual point. You exist as a player character and as a piece of the fiction, in the exact same position every major character in this story occupies, instrumentalized by forces larger than yourself, guided by a will you did not choose, and cannot fully understand or verify, and yet still, within that constrained, shaped, uncertain position, capable of exercising a real, consequential, individual will of your own. The game doesn't resolve the tension between greater will and individual will. It asks you to live inside that tension for 100+ hours, and then asks you to make a choice anyway, with the full knowledge that you will never get final confirmation of whether it was the correct one, because the entity whose approval might theoretically confirm that for you has never spoken clearly enough in the entire history of this world for anyone, mortal, demigod, or Empyrean, to ever be fully certain. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the greater will. If you found this useful or interesting, let me know in the comments what other Elden Ring or Shadow of the Erdtree topics you'd want covered in this kind of depth, and I'll see you in the next one.